Good afternoon, Maine. Welcome to the Muddy Waters Podcast. The Muddy Waters Podcast exists, as you all know, to help the people of Maine better understand what's going on here in the state of Maine. We do that not because I know everything or I'm an expert in everything, but because I bring on people who are experts or who have experiences that need to be shared that, for instance, the mainstream media, whose job it is to help inform the people about what's going on in our state, instead ignore. And so with that, today we are fortunate to have with us Daniel Schmid, I should say, of Liberty Counsel. Thank you for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you, Chuck, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, really happy to be. Well, I should say I'm happy to have you here, but it's unfortunate that you need to be here, and we're in this situation where, there are, assaults on our freedoms in general that are happening in our society, and in particular on some religious liberties here in the state of Maine by what I can just call a corrupt government, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. And so I just wanted to have you on to share about a couple of things that are happening here in the state of Maine, cases that you've worked in the past in your role for Liberty Counsel, but also just in general, I guess, start by sharing, I guess, who you are, where you come from, and then talk a little bit about Liberty Counsel itself and what you guys do.
Yeah, sure. I'm Associate Vice President of Legal Affairs for Liberty Counsel, and if your listeners don't know, we're a civil liberties litigation firm. Essentially, we represent churches and religious institutions and individuals for First Amendment matters, free exercise of religion. Our core pillars are kind of the family, life, and religious liberty. And so that's primarily what we focus our cases on, which touches on speech and religious exercise. And anywhere the government tries to infringe an individual's First Amendment liberties, Liberty Counsel's there to stand in the gap for those people and to represent them. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, we've had several of those instances that have taken place in Maine. And that's why we're here today, as you know.
Yeah, no, it's great what you guys do, and just so thankful that there are people. Unfortunately, there aren't really a lot of law firms, obviously, in individual states that cover that kind of stuff. So fortunately, like we have a number of firms. You're one of the ones that I know of that works and helps focus on these issues nationwide. And so I really appreciate the work that you guys do and representing people here in the state of Maine over against, corruption. And, one of the cases that we'll get to in a bit there was a podcast that was done by Steve Robinson of the Maine Wire on the religious liberty of the church in Belfast that was trying to purchase. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But there was also, another case that I heard about. I saw, talking about the mainstream media and how it's a job to inform the people and how it's failing to do so. I saw an article that came out a number of months ago in World Magazine about a case where a mom does not have the right to take her daughter to church, and that the father has full control there. And I was like, what? And I'm just so surprised that very few people have picked up this story at all, especially locally. And obviously, given the fact that the Portland Press Herald and the other mainstream news services here in the state of Maine are effectively propaganda arms of the left, they don't really want to report on something that would make them look bad and cause people to take a deeper look at what the heck is going on in our state. So I wanted you to, tell us what happened in this case, like what is going on. And, fortunately, again, I will highlight too that the Christian Civic League of Maine sat down with the pastor of the mom, and there's a podcast to check out there to hear a little bit more about it. But what in the world is happening?
Yeah, there was a custody dispute between a mother and father who had a child out of wedlock many years ago. And the child is now older, but still a minor. And the father did not like the fact that mother had given her life to Christ and was now attending Calvary Chapel in Portland. He brought a claim in the court there in Portland to modify parental rights in the custodial arrangement because he said that the church there was a cult. Now, if your listeners don't know, Calvary Chapel is a very mainstream evangelical denomination. They're located in every state across all 50 states of America and teach very traditional biblical views on salvation and sexuality and marriage and the family and all of the traditional things that churches teach. Father didn't like that. So he moved to modified custodial rights, and they had a trial, a hearing that went on a couple of days, in which his lawyers brought in a so-called cult expert from a university in California. You can imagine how that went. The order was so egregious as to say that even that the church was a cult because it had a quote Moses-like figure. The pastor was unaccountable to some other board, which is basically true of almost every denomination save the Catholic Church and some other hierarchical Presbyterians, whatnot have you. But they said because he stands alone as the pastor, like many other Protestant denominations, he's a Moses-like figure who's unaccountable. And he preaches about eternal life, heaven, hell, salvation. Those are the tenets of every religion, for one. Every religion is man's attempt to reach God as they see him, and the eternal life being the goal, or salvation, redemption, what have you. Have different religions call it different things. And he teaches that from a biblical perspective. The judge said that that made him cult-like because it's scary to a child to hear about the afterlife, to hear about eternal condemnation and the views that Christians across America have. And at the end of the hearing and at the end of the trial, the judge said, yeah, it is a cult, and I'm going to prohibit you, mom, from taking this child to that church ever again. And in addition to that, if you want to try any other church, you must go hat in hand to father and get his permission. He has veto power over any church that mother might wish to take her child, all because they taught religious values. It's one of the most egregious orders I have ever seen from any. Liberty Counsel does not do very much custody litigation because there's not a lot of religious freedom implications for them. So it's just not our bailiwick, if you will. But this one was so egregious, we decided to take over the appeal at their request to correct what is a gross violation of the free exercise clause, to tell a fit mother that the judge admitted in the order was fit and competent and was looking out for the best interest of her child, that she can no longer take her to church because there's a quote Moses-like figure there.
Yeah, I mean, that just like, this is the thing that just blows my mind is the part that you just cited, right? The fact that the judge determined that she is a fit mother, and yet she has no right, like, to determine like what type of church her daughter can go to.
That's right. And we see this all the time. So this is not like a unique scenario in custody disputes. There have been across the country, and it's a majority of states that have adopted this rule because it makes sense, which is if there are parents who are no longer married or they no longer living together, when child is with father, father gets to make the determination as to what religious institution or church or establishment he takes the child to. When child's with mother, mother gets the same rights. So if dad's an every other weekend dad and he goes to the First Baptist Church of Portland, he can take child to First Baptist Church of Portland. If mother wants to go to Calvary Chapel, she takes him to Calvary Chapel. And we have seen this in much more complicated cases across the country where you had Muslim father and evangelical Christian mother. Now, how those two got together in marriage, I don't know, but that's
Yeah.
they did. And there are cases that say, well, no, when child's with dad, he can go to the mosque, and when child's with mother, he can go to the church. There have been Jewish and Christian, there have been Catholic and Protestant, there have been all manner of examples in which this exact scenario played out. What the courts are not permitted to do is take a fit mother like our client and say, you can't go to the church of your choice because you teach the Bible and the Bible is scary. That the First Amendment knows no such nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like an assault on obviously religious liberty and freedom of religion, right? Like, which, and the idea that, like, Absolutely. If dad wants to take the child somewhere else, or doesn't want to go to church, or wants to instill values and give the child the option, I think they should consider faith, especially in Jesus, because I think there's no hope anywhere else. But like the reality is, like, when his parental rights, right, and they're in this together at the and so when the child, like you said, like what normally happens when the child is with dad is the one who determines whether or not they go to church or where they go to church, and when the child is with mom, vice versa. And so the idea that like they would determine both that she's a fit mother, I just want to highlight this, because like she's a fit mother, has the best interest of the child at heart, and at the same time, but not enough to let her make decisions about whether or not she go to church. Now, one of the things that which is just wild, but one of the things that I'd also heard, and I wanted to see, I thought I'd heard either in the article, was were there also limitations put on her to be able to allow her daughter to have access to, talking to other kids from the church, or whether or not she herself could talk to her daughter about her faith?
Correct. There are some limitations there, and they're specifically tied to, but and I'll back up 1 second. The order is basically nothing to do with Calvary Chapel in Portland, which is the church of her choosing, because the court admitted the testimony and accepted the testimony of a quote unquote expert from California on what cults are. Now, an expert that would say a mainstream Protestant denomination is a cult isn't somebody we ought to be listening to. That is so uncredible that it's almost comical. That should not have been accepted. That's what makes the order egregious. But to your point, which is, not only was she limited in her ability to take her to the church, but she was restricted in her ability to show her any materials produced by or affiliated with the church. Well, one doesn't have to think too complexly to think, well, the Bible, which is taught at Calvary Chapel, is at least arguably affiliated with or associated with Calvary Chapel. So does this mother violate the order by reading the Bible to the child? It's an open question. Certainly materials that are produced by Calvary Chapel, which relate to its teachings and the Bible for kids or whatever materials they produce, she can't show them to her. She cannot take her to events that are related to Calvary Chapel. She wanted to go, I'll give you one example. At one point in the litigation, she wanted to go to a Christian concert that was in the area. Well, because of the order, she has to go hat in hand to dad and say, is that okay that I take her to a concert? It's not at Calvary Chapel. It has nothing to do with Calvary Chapel, but because it could be arguably affiliated with Calvary Chapel as a Christian concert, she had to ask. And of course, dad, who doesn't like Christianity or Calvary Chapel or the teachings of both, said no. So the order is so egregious that it could, even in the minute details, prohibit her from reading the Bible to her child because it's scary and cult-like. That is so unconstitutional, it almost baffles the mind.
Yeah, I mean, it blows my mind that somebody talking about a mainstream, because I know Pastor Travis, the pastor over there. I've actually had him on my podcast. We've talked about theology and a number of other things, and I'm an opinionated person, so I'm sure we can find some areas where he and I would disagree. But like when it comes to the core teachings of his church, they're literally just historic Christianity. This is what we're talking about, right? This is just teaching the Bible. And so for teaching the Bible and going through it word by word, which is what Calvary Chapel does. And for the record, I don't go to that church. I really like Travis, but I have another church that I go to that does some similar stuff in terms of their teaching wise. Not going to see a significant difference, but the Calvary Chapel denomination, what they do is they just teach the Word of God verse by verse, and they don't leave anything out, and they believe in the historic truth of what the Bible actually says. We do this thing called exegesis, right? Which is let the Scripture speak, and then we understand what that means, and then apply it to our lives in our current context. But basically, rather than trying to find ways to make it look like the Scripture says what we want it to say, they They focus on figuring out what the scripture actually teaches, and then they teach on it, which is why they have positions on issues which culturally today are, well, there may be a shift coming, but the areas in our culture where the church, especially in Cumberland County where I live, is less exciting, I guess, to the locals. But they teach they preach the whole counsel of God, essentially, is
Yeah,
the
and that
idea.
was, now that you pointed out, that was actually one of the objections that the quote unquote cult expert had, as well as the judge, which was that Calvary Chapel teaches verse by verse, chapter by chapter, including the Old Testament. And some of the stories in the Old Testament involve war, involve good and evil. That was another objection. The court had this teaching of good and evil, that there is good, that there is evil. So the teaching largely of objective truth is what the order prohibits her from doing. You as Calvary Chapel in Portland are a cult because you teach that there are objectively things that are right and objectively things that are wrong. And that's the part where this is so egregious, it's almost baffles the mind, because to get there is to run roughshod over the First Amendment and to ignore everything this country was birthed on, which was that we were premised on the notion that you came here for religious freedom and sought out the new world to avoid this exact thing. Having to go to the crown to ask whether you could go to church and whether the message from that church was approved by a judge or the crown in England. That's why we're here. That's why we have the republic, and yet we're still fighting the same battle almost 250 years later.
Yeah. No, like I said, it's mind blowing that this could happen. I feel like this has been happening since 2020 hit, where another thing comes up that is just absolutely wild and so hard for me to believe is actually happening in our world. Like that, you would have said, if you had told me that something like this could happen, 10 years ago, I would have said that you're absolutely out of your mind, right? But the fact of the matter is, we have corrupt. I mean, there's nothing. I can't come to any conclusion outside of the fact that this person is biased against Christianity, and they're literally using their position as a judge not to administer along the lines of the Constitution and make sure that they're protecting the rights of the individual, in this case the mom, which also is really interesting, right? Like typically the courts will favor the women, but in this case, with a fit mother who they literally said has the child's best interest at heart, she is not able to take her daughter to church. And I think
there's a cottage industry based on that, which is now in all, I'm sure they're in Maine, they're everywhere, that there are cottage lawyers who have started out representing males in these custody disputes because they have taken it over the chin for years. Generally speaking, you lose if you're the dad.
Right.
Here, we have flipped that on its head, and the only basis for doing so was that the mother was religious. In any other context, that never would have fly.
Yeah. Well, and I think even in America, like if the mother had been, in this case, if the mother had been Muslim or Buddhist or something like that, the judge probably doesn't make the decision that they make, right?
Or a lesbian who wants to go to some affirming church in Portland, they would say, "Oh, please take the child there. You must." But here, because it's evangelical and they teach verse by verse, chapter by chapter, what is, as you say, the whole counsel of God, she can't go there.
Yeah. Just so wild that we're here. I can't emphasize that enough, that here in the state of Maine, this is what judges they have are able to get away with. It's I think egregious is one of the only ways to explain it, but it's obviously evil. One of the other elements of it that I also heard was that dad has full authority over medical.
He does.
Decisions.
And the premise behind that, now, you mentioned COVID a moment ago in 2020 when the world collectively lost its mind. Mother had some sincere objections to and concerns about the COVID vaccination regime. Now, all these many years later, all of us who questioned it were called kooks and conspiracy theorists back in the day. Now the evidence is overwhelming that we were correct. That it was dangerous, that there were some side effects that were significant and ignored and indeed buried by the pharmaceutical companies. But in this instance, mother had some objections to them based on religion. And she said she prays and seeks the Lord's guidance on what she should and should not put in her child's body, one of which she objected to was the COVID vaccine. The father used that to say, see, she shouldn't be given any decisions over medical care either, because she allows her cult-like religion to influence her medical decision making. And the judge said that's right. She was no harm to the child, and the judge made specific note in the order that of course she was looking out for her best interest, but because her judgment is clouded by her cult-like pastor and Moses-like figure at the church, she gets no medical decision making over the child either. And it was just tied up with the religious questions that were inherent. So now she's lost her ability to take her child to church of her choosing. And also she has lost the ability to have any say-so whatsoever in what vaccinations her child has, because the judge said your religious views cloud that. And even though I think you're acting in her best interest, I have to question that because of your religious views.
Wow. Yeah. Again, I'm kind of stunned and speechless that to the fact that we're here today. And, obviously, as you said, like I was skeptical of the COVID-19 vaccine from the beginning, particularly because all the Democrats and the liberals were like, we're not touching that thing until Biden got elected. And then they were like, where can I sign up? They were talking about how, we don't have enough time to test it to ensure that it's right, this, that, and the other thing. They were all talking about that. And then all of a sudden, as soon as Biden gets elected, they change their mind and they're fine with it. And more than
not only fine with it, but cramming it down everyone's throats and saying you can't earn a living in America unless you take it.
Yeah, and they literally wanted people to get fired and lose their job to force them to get this vaccine, which unfortunately, because they're probably not paying attention, they haven't done additional research, right? They remember what happened in the early days of COVID, and they forget everything else, right? Because they stopped paying attention. What they saw in the early days of COVID was that Maine was doing well in terms of, illness and death during the early days. And then once Maine started to look bad, the local news sites stopped reporting the data. And that's when people stopped paying attention, and they don't realize that Maine actually was worse than most of the rest of the nation, despite being rural, or other parts that did different things, like Florida and Texas, and I think Idaho, and some of the places where there was more freedom around this. People don't realize that, and so yeah, that's they don't. A lot of people in Maine, because they're liberal and they still believe the mainstream media and the mainstream narrative, they've not seen that data. So despite the fact that you and I know, right, that the data now supports the people who are skeptical about the vaccine, especially the data that's coming out of places like Israel and Japan, where they basically vaccinated everyone until in Japan they realized, oh, this is not good, and they stopped. And the data shows that, like, if you got the vaccine, I don't have the data, do some research, but you're more likely to get ill and die from COVID, even though COVID's like so far in the past in a lot of ways, in my mind anyway, but you're more likely to die from COVID. You would have been if you had gotten the vaccine than if you did not. That's what
from the adverse effects of it. And it's an interesting segue because, one of the cases also we had in Maine was on behalf of healthcare workers. Now, we did not prevail in that, and that's one of the great disappointments of my career. But you had healthcare workers in the state of Maine who had sincere enough convictions to say, the state of Maine said, take the jab or take a hike. You can't work in the healthcare industry unless you take this shot. And there were some who said, I have sincere objections to that, and I'm not going to do it. Now, the First Amendment and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and a whole host of other constitutional and lawful provisions entitled them to an accommodation, and they weren't afforded it. The state of Maine said, we don't care. Federal law doesn't apply here, and neither should you. And they kicked them all out of the industry for their sincere religious convictions. And the great irony of all of that is, you were mentioning a moment ago, the Democrats who said, I'll never take that because that came from Trump and I don't trust that he's trying to do X, Y, and Z. And then when Biden got in, they said, oh, not only will I, you must. I'm not convinced all of those people took it, but that's a whole separate side issue.
Sure. Yeah.
Might have been a saline solution injected in, but that's a conversation for a different day.
Sure.
But what happened in Maine is they said, you will take it or you'll be gone. And not 6, 8 months before, from 2020 into the latter part of 2021, when the mandates were issued, every single one of the healthcare workers we represented in Maine were hailed as heroes by their government because they got up every morning and went to the hospitals and went to the clinics and went everywhere they were supposed to go and tended to the sick people. They tended to those with COVID. They tended to those who had other issues and were perhaps fearful of COVID. But they did it at their own expense and at their own peril, and they didn't ask for anything more. And when it came time for us to return the favor, the state of Maine said, no, you're out. And
Yeah.
all of them were fired from their job for accepting or for refusing to accept a vaccination that now we know didn't work to prevent transmission in the first place. And oh, by the way, it was pretty dangerous for all those people to take anyway, with all the side effects and adverse reactions that occurred. And that was a great tragedy in Maine.
Yeah.
That should have been rectified, and it was. And we went all the way to the Supreme Court twice, and the Supreme Court didn't take it, and they should have, because that was a gross intrusion into their First Amendment rights, and it deserved to be rectified. We're still fighting that battle in some other states. That's still ongoing. But in Maine, the court's there because they tend to be, I hate to say it, but the bench and the bar there tend to be fairly liberal, and they did not agree with us. And everybody lost their collective mind during that 30-month period and just ignored what the Constitution demanded, ignored what Title VII demanded. And people were forced to choose between their religious convictions and their ability to feed their families. And because they had sincere objections, they chose to follow their heart and their religious beliefs, and they were fired for doing so. And it's a great shame.
Yeah, my mom was one of those people. I do know you need to get going pretty quick, but yeah, my mom was one of those people, and it was one of the biggest disappointments. I was very excited to see Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, but she's the one that just chose not to take up that case, if I'm not mistaken, right?
She was. Well, it was a couple. We had an emergency petition, and Judge Gorsuch wrote a dissent in one of them saying, this involves a significant constitutional error and we ought to correct it now. These people are going to be fired. We tried to prevent them from being fired and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Justice Gorsuch and Alito said their plight is worthy of our attention, but they didn't take it. And Justice Barrett was the one who said, well, at this emergency posture, we think it's probably not how we should address it. And what we tried to convince them of unsuccessfully was, you have to address it now or never. Yeah. The mandate kicks in 2 days from now when we were at the Supreme Court. And if you don't act now, they're all going to be fired. And they said, well, come back to us after the merits of the case are concluded. Well, what happened? So we go back down, sought longer relief after they were already terminated to say, hey, this was wrong, and they were entitled to keep their jobs, but they're at least entitled to money now because you wrongfully terminated them, and Title VII says the hospitals ought to pay them. And what happened after that? The governor said, never mind. I'll revoke the mandate. And then what did the court say? Oh, it's too late. We can't do anything now. And that's what we were trying to tell the Supreme Court and the First Circuit and the District of Maine. We went to every level and said, look, this is what's going to happen. And they're going to say, never mind. You can't do that. Yeah. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution sets a different order of priority, and Maine doesn't get to decide for themselves that federal law doesn't apply in vacation land. That's not how it works. But that's what they did, and the courts let them get away with it, and it's a great shame. And you're right to note that there were 5 conservatives on the bench who could have helped every single one of those people and could have prevented that from ever occurring, and they should have. And what Justice Alito said, their plight is worthy of our attention, was merited then, it's merited now, but they never got it.
Yeah. Well, that's incredibly disappointing. Failures of a conservative Supreme Court on a number of levels, and then failures at every other level. And here in the state of Maine, unfortunately, we have a Democrat-controlled House, Senate, judiciary, and governorship. And so there's not much we can do until we flip those things. So if you're at home, what can we do? Figure out what you can do to help flip Maine red so that we can get the right people in those positions and overturn. I mean, hopefully at the Maine Supreme Court, where the case we heard earlier is currently going, hopefully it gets overturned there. And if not, on to the Supreme Court, and we can set a precedent on that potentially. But but yeah, we need to get the right people in those positions, and we have to have a Republican victory. Even if you're not yourself a Republican, you have to recognize that the left has gone crazy. The Democrat Party is not the Democrat Party of the 90s. They have lost their minds. They have abandoned reason. And they have, are full of violations of the Constitution. And so we need to win in 2026.
And
and
at
so
all levels.
Yeah,
So
at all
you
levels.
see
Yep.
this, the one we hadn't gotten to yet, but if you have time, we ought to spend a moment talking about it, is the church in Belfast, Maine.
Yeah.
So there you had, it matters at the governor level, it matters at the presidential level, it matters the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, every level matters. But it goes down even into the administrators. So Calvary Chapel in Belfast tried to purchase a property under a open procurement process for the Hutchinson Center in Belfast, Maine. University of Maine system put it out for sale through an open bidding process. It was all anonymous, and everybody got an equal chance to bid and submit their highest and best. And Calvary Chapel Belfast submitted and won the bid. Theirs was the highest bid. The terms and conditions were the best. And there were people in the community who said, we didn't want that. We wanted either the W caps, and I know there's a lot of caps in Maine across the state.
Yeah.
And W cap was one, or Waldo.
NGOs taking all the government money that Elon was trying to root out. Yeah, that's the caps.
Exactly what it is. Soros money and all the rest, U.S. taxpayer money to boot. And then there was another nonprofit group that objected to it and said, you can't sell what used to be university property to a religious group. They have views that are discriminatory. And one of the things they highlighted, again, going back to what we had in the custody dispute, was Calvary Chapel teaches the Bible verse by verse, chapter by chapter, as you said, the whole counsel of God. Well, so does Calvary Chapel in Belfast. And that was one of the objections that was lodged by alumni, by employees, by donors who said, we will not give you another dime if you sell this building to Calvary Chapel. And then you had legislators, the local state senator there saying, hey, I used to support University of Maine, but now I'm probably going to have to reconsider whether we're going to fund you guys if you don't reverse this bad decision. And so they incited this mob, went after the board of trustees, and then they made this decision that was so procedurally improper. It makes it so pretextual and so unconstitutional. It's not even within the realm of reason. And they just rescinded the bid, made it up as they went so that they could deprive Calvary Chapel of that bid, force them to sue, which we are now involved in litigation to this day, trying to prevent the sale of that to a bidder who participated in the second rigged process, not the first open process that the church won. And it's example after example in Maine, and it's a shame. It's across the state. We saw it with the church lockdowns beginning in COVID, where Governor Mills shut down the churches like every other state did. We had to represent Ken Graves and Calvary Chapel, Portland in that case to get the churches open.
Calvary Chapel's fighting some fights, it looks like, and you
all
guys are
over Maine.
Yeah.
And we're there to help them, and we're pleased to do so, because every single one of them, as you say, stands for the whole counsel of God, and we're there to have their back. And it's a pleasure to do so, and hopefully we can ratchet up some victories, because it's a dark place at the moment in Maine. The leadership the Bible told us that would be true, that those who hate God love death and the rest of it. And the cross is foolishness to those who don't believe. And I think we saw that with the orders in the custody dispute, to think that an evangelical mainstream church is a cult suggests that's absolutely true, which we know it is, that the cross is foolishness to those who don't know it, who haven't experienced its redemptive power. And so we continue to fight those battles. We've had many of them. I'm sure we'll have more until your listeners can ensure new guards for their future security, as the Declaration said.
Yeah, and that's what we've got to be about. So thank you for representing these organizations here in the state of Maine against the egregious acts being taken essentially by our government. I mean, that's our judges, right? And then the University of Maine system is a government organization and they're at all levels violating the Constitution, sometimes out of people's misguided misunderstanding of what separation of church and state is. I think that's partly played into like the Belfast thing, why people were so against, oh, you can't sell this to a religious organization because it's a religious organization. And it's because they don't understand that separation of church and state is about not allowing the government to tell the church what to do. And it's also not in the Constitution. Fun fact, freedom of religion is in the Constitution, and separation of church and state is in a letter written from, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, to a church, effectively saying that the government
to the Danbury Baptists.
Telling them that the government couldn't tell them what they could and could not believe, rather than anything else. But there's a gross misunderstanding in our culture about what that means, and that people just think it means that they can't. Anyway, like a Christian can't get involved in politics and bring their views with them, or some of these silly things that have come up. I think there was another situation in Belfast where they were going to deny a church access to public area that they would allow anybody else to have access to, but because they were going to perform a service there, they decided they were saying, oh no, we can't do that because of separation of church and state. They were challenged, and they lost that challenge. The town did, and they ended up changing their vote once they realized what the actual law was. Were you guys involved in that?
I was not. I was called on it, and did some behind the scenes speaking with some individuals. I was aware of it, but we never ended up having to get involved because it was rectified. But
pretty quickly,
it's like you say, over and over again in Maine, they seem to ignore it. I'd like to believe it was out of ignorance. I think sometimes it is. I think more often, as we saw in the cases we just discussed, it's not ignorance, it's hostility towards God and his church and his word. And so that's a shame. The Constitution protected everybody in Maine's right to engage in their religious exercise, and we're there to help them do so.
Well, thank you so much for what you guys do. And if somebody has a situation that they run into where their rights are being challenged, how would they get in touch with you guys?
Just visit us at lc.org, just like Liberty Counsel, lc.org, and you can find legal help forms to request help with your situation, or just information, or follow the cases that we have in Maine. You can follow along there. We provide information and updates as they come along, but lc.org, and we'll be happy to help you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Everybody else, we'll be back here tomorrow, and we've got an individual who's going to be talking about some voter fraud illegal voting that's happening in Maine, and he's got some stories, and he's got the receipts, so to speak. We're going to be talking a little bit about that, as well as some of the impacts of Maine choosing not to comply with Title IX. So we'll see you all here tomorrow. Thanks again, Daniel.
My pleasure. Thank you.